Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here are a couple of my red wiggler worm bins that I plan on feeding today. And as far as kitchen scraps go, I have only coffee, used coffee. So I thought I would supplement today's feeding with something that the worms probably really like, but don't really get as often as they probably should lately. I guess ever since I got myself a shredder, I've been providing my worms with a whole bunch of shredded cardboard and paper. And the one thing that has sort of dropped off a bit lately in terms of a bedding source has been the leaves. So it was not too long ago that I bought in a big bucket, not a big bucket, but a bucket with a whole bunch of leaves in it. And my thinking was that in addition to some coffee, we would just give them some leaves. Look at all these springtails. Oh brother. I do have one other system where I've got springtails hanging out, and I've been attempting to reduce their numbers in that other system, and I've just been kind of hoping and praying that I don't end up finding the same sort of springtail outbreak situation happening elsewhere, but it does seem like it's occurring over here to a certain degree. By no means as drastic as what I'm seeing over in my mixed worm bin, but here too I'm starting to see the presence of some springtails. And in that other system where I'm attempting to reduce their numbers, I guess my main strategy has been to try to reduce the amount of moisture in the system so that maybe their numbers will drop off a little bit. And I guess maybe by applying some of this dry leafy material, maybe we can result here in a little bit of additional drying. Because it does seem to me like the moisture level in here is ample and probably could do with a little bit of drying. Especially if the result of doing so is that we reduce the number of springtails hanging out in the system. 2 weeks since we last fed these bins, and they got stuff like Brussels sprout leaves and things like that. I took a quick look through the video from that last check-in, so I doubt that any of the things we gave them 2 weeks ago are still going to be showing up here as leftovers. But we'll see once we get down the middle. We fed down the middle over through the middle section of the bins. But before we dive in to see how they're doing with that last feeding, I figured I would just sort of check the sections of the bin other than the middle to see how things look. Now here, this one that I'm digging in is the older of the two. A lot of times when I buddy up systems like this, oftentimes they're the same age. However, in this case we've got a bin that's a little bit older, which is this one right here. And this one's been in service for 144 days, has been fed 12 times, so today's feeding is going to register as feeding number 13. And then this system over here is a little bit younger, 109 days of age at this point, fed 9 times so far, today getting its 10th feeding. And I definitely noticed when I was probing around, especially over on that edge of the other bin over there, very damp over there. So I could certainly see the benefit to sprinkling in some dry stuff, which would hopefully absorb some of the moisture that's floating around in here, which seems to be a bit excessive. So to me it seems like maybe even a beneficial thing to be adding somewhat drier bedding today. Maybe since I've got so much of it here, maybe we can even use it as sort of a top covering. Something I like to do occasionally is just sprinkle the entire top surface of my worm bins with some leafy material. Kind of gives it that nice homey appearance. Nice natural substance. Spread out across the top, and then maybe it'll even start to absorb some of the moisture that's present within the system into itself and help things dry off a tad. Definitely seems to be a greater number of worms here in the older bin. I believe this system, I didn't write down the numbers, but I believe that the estimated worm count of this bin is somewhere between 16 and 1700 worms when it was first launched 144 days ago, whereas the population that we estimated to be living in this bin over here is at least the starting estimate was thought to be a little bit less than 1,000. I'm using rough numbers because I didn't write down the exact figures. I brought down some notes indicating to us the age of each system and how many times it's been fed, but I didn't come prepared with the estimates on how many worms live in each system. So now that we're probing down into the feeding area, I'm going to be careful to not disturb or damage too much a test object that's in here, and it's in both bins. We attempted to compost a piece of towel, and right there I'm seeing the very edge of the towel where the material is sort of folded over and sewn along the edge. So that's the very edge of the towel. You got to remember, these pieces of towel that were placed in here were pretty good size, and it does seem like the majority of the single layer fabric down the middle has probably been eaten for the most part, and the only reason this is still holding up is because it's the section of the towel on the edge where it's folded over and sewn, making it a little bit more challenging for the worms to break it down, since it's multiple layers, double layers at least, I believe. But it's definitely making nice progress at this point. Towel's been in these bins now for 13 weeks, and that's 91 days. That's another little tidbit of information that I wrote down on my little scribble scratch board off on the side. I think it is quite evident as we look through this system that the worm population is a little bit less than what we saw over in the older bin. Here's another little fragment of the towel, and I'm sure there's more of it in here. I'm just failing to recognize it as towel. Here's another little bit of it. But as it starts to break away from the main large piece and become just small little chunks, it becomes tougher and tougher to spot it and identify it. And eventually it'll all be gone. There was a point in time not too long ago, perhaps a couple years at this point. It's been a while though. Not too long ago, but it's been a while. I'm kind of contradicting myself there. But I did the same towel that you see here. It's a piece of towel that I still even have leftovers of. I've got a good piece of it, as a matter of fact, that would still need to be composted eventually at some point in time in the future. So it was I don't even know, maybe a couple years ago I composted some of that towel once before, and I did find that it sat around, then it seemed like very quickly it sort of finally got to the point where the worms were ready to break it down, and then it seemed to vanish very quickly at that point. So perhaps these pieces of towel are now also arriving at that point in time when they're ready to be broken down. Look at this mango seed. The mango seed is actually inside this husk thing, and you can see the worms have really made themselves at home down within the shell, much more so than what we saw in the other container. I guess with a lot more worms there's a greater likelihood of finding large amounts of them when you go probing through the section where we last fed them. And since this system has quite possibly twice as many worms, or close to that, it's not too surprising to see a good mob scene going on as we excavate through where the last feeding was applied. A lot of moisture down here too. Alright, here's some of the towel. I know I bumped into a little bit of it earlier, but I didn't really pay much attention to it, so here's a little piece of it. There's got to be more. Good bit of moisture down here. I think it'll definitely benefit this system to get some dry bedding down in the feeding area to suck up some of this moisture. And the other system doesn't seem quite as important to try to reduce the amount of moisture. Here I believe it is, because I'd like to try to nip the expansion of the springtail population in the bud before they kind of get to this out of control stage like they seem to be in my mixed worm bin. Over there it just feels like they've, gotten to the point where their numbers are just way out of control, way more than I want to see in any of my worm bins. So, I think we're at that point where we can feed. Surprising to bump into the cork. Actually, we do bump into it almost every time. But that cork's been floating around from system to system for many years now. And it's just ended up here over the course of time, and it does seem to be finally making some progress. For the first probably couple years, I don't remember seeing hardly any progress on it. But now it does seem like it's getting pretty pitted, and maybe the worms are finally able to start nibbling on it. So let's see here. This was going to be my idea, was some leaves. I've also got some soiled paper towels that I'd like to include as well. So we'll mix it all up. We'll get a little bit of this, a little bit of that in there. The paper towels, here's one that's got a good bit of coffee stains and other stuff soiling it. These are somewhat cleaner, but all this stuff counts as bedding when you're feeding your worm bins. And the fact that it's all going in dry, I think, is going to be a good thing as well. And you know what? All this stuff that was floating out on the top surface is also going to be a really good bedding material to include with the feedings. So we'll just spread it around, and I'm including even these feeding zone indicators, these coffee filters that we usually use to mark where we last fed, because I've got coffee for them as well today, which includes a couple nice new replacement coffee filters to be our feeding zone indicators. So let's bring them right in, as long as we're talking about them. The other thing I sometimes include when I'm feeding coffee to my worm bins is a little bit of my worm chow. So we'll do that here too. Oh, let's not forget about these leftovers and the towel. So you know what? The towel is what I want to really focus their attention on, if it's possible to do that at all. So right there on top of the coffee, I thought maybe that would be a good place to try to drape out the remaining bits of the towel, and then bring in the leftover foods that we encountered along the way, kind of sandwiching those objects, those towel bits, right in between the old food and the new food, hopefully putting it right in the line of fire so that the worms bump into it and work it down. That's pretty cool though. I really like to see how the worms are working that object down. The pit of a mango is usually quite a tough thing, especially getting past the shell, but once they're in there, they're gonna do away with that little seed in there, and probably eventually do away with the husk of the seed as well. And the stuff I'm sprinkling in now, more dry material. This is my worm chow. I usually do mix worm chow with the coffee when I'm feeding my worm bins. And it does seem to me like we could certainly keep going here with more bedding material, especially in this bin where the moisture seems a bit much. I've just got this feeling the next time we come in here, these feeding zones are probably still going to be somewhat dry. Although by covering up with the plastic that was on here in the very beginning, whatever moisture is in the system will tend to recirculate and hopefully dampen the stuff that's going in here dry. That's usually my aim, but sometimes it doesn't quite work out that way, and I come back days or weeks later and find that there's still a good bit of dry stuff down within my systems. So we'll see how that goes. Hopefully it helps us sort of reduce the overall moisture content in these bins, especially here in this one where it does seem like a bit of drying would be beneficial, not only just for the general consistency of the material in the system, but also to hopefully create an environment where it's a little bit less hospitable for the springtails to be out here in such force and in such good numbers. Not that it's really so much quite yet, but it does seem like it has the potential to go that way if we don't try to keep an eye on it. So you know what? I think I'm gonna set these feeding zone indicators aside briefly, and we'll put them back where they belong after we do what I mentioned earlier, which is to come back in here with a nice top coating of these leaves. Spread it out across the entire top surface of the bin. And here in this system, the older one where the moisture seems a bit more abundant, I think I might go a little bit thicker on this top layer. And then on the other one we'll do the same, but perhaps not quite as much. Perhaps more for show, for the aesthetics of it. And it will almost certainly absorb some moisture into itself. Once the moisture down within the material attempts to evaporate and escape the system, it'll get caught by the plastic coverings, condense, and on its way back down, hopefully dampen the top covering of leaves. Alright, that's pretty cool. I like how that looks. So basically all that newspaper that was draped out as sort of a top covering in these two systems has now been more or less replaced with leaves. Stuff that the worms will probably consider to be a much more, I don't know, much more natural substance, or a substance that they're much more acquainted with. When it comes to worms, you just have to assume that leaves are the main thing that they like. But that brings us to the end of this check-in. So I've got a few more things I've got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away. But I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. It's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.